In the novel, there's a big old house in a village called Burtonport, which is on the west coast of Ireland. We first encounter it, we sort of first encounter it when Roisin, who is a young adolescent, so I think at this time she's about 13, and her and her sister have always told stories and been quite interested in this big old house, which has been abandoned for all of their childhoods. And then one day, a bunch of people move into this house and they are not like other people in the village. So the way I sort of imagined it, it's a very rural Irish village where it's all sort of families. There aren't adults living sort of unmarried, not having children kind of lives. And then this group arrive and they're all adults who are unmarried, and there's a lot of them, and they're just very weird. And I wanted to see it through the eyes of this girl who would never have seen people living like this before. And she notices that they're painting weird symbols on the outside of the house, and everyone's a bit scared to go near them. They don't want to get too involved with them, but she notices over time there's this newspaper article that comes out where they explain who these people are, and they've set up a commune where they practice primal scream therapy. And I wanted to look at, you don't really see inside the commune, but I wanted to look at how we tell stories and how we, particularly in neighborhoods, I think we create this idea of who people are from the outside without actually stepping inside and seeing what they're like. But I also had a personal connection to the screamers and my own way that I discovered it, which is that I was living in Ireland with an older woman and working with her on an old boat that she had, restoring this 50-foot, 100-year-old boat. And I'd been in Ireland for a little while, and I think people were realizing that I wasn't just a tourist who was there for the summer. And I also had a bicycle, and no one else had a bicycle in this village that I lived in. So I was bicycling around, and quite often people would stop in their car beside me on the road, and they give me a high vis jacket, because I come from London where you don't really need to wear a high vis jacket because there's street lighting everywhere. So I think they were a bit concerned that I was cycling around and that I might get hit by a car. And then one day this guy stopped and he said, I've seen you around, what are you doing here? And I explained that I was here and I was working on this old boat. And he goes, oh, that boat. And I said, what do you mean? And he goes, well, that's the Screamers boat. And it turns out that Anne, the woman who I was living with, had been in the Screamers. It was at a later period than is covered in the book, when they were living on an island off the coast of Burtonport. So they'd moved on from being in that house. But yeah, I was just fascinated by, she was a really inspiring woman to me. And she did have this way of being where she was able to really speak her mind and not care what other people thought of her. And the more research I did about it, the more I felt I needed to include it in some way. As I was saying before, I think there's the public perception of what primal scream therapy is, which is people doing a lot of screaming. And I think people's perception of it is that it's very woo-woo. It's these people are very unhinged. But then from my understanding of actually looking into it, they weren't screaming all the time, but it was, I think it was a Jungian concept, which was, it's kind of what we see therapy as being like today, where you will, if you have reservations about how interaction has gone with someone, you'll bring it up with them and you're very open about stuff, and you look into why you've reacted the way that you have done, and basically just doing therapy where you're figuring out why you have the scars that you might have. And I think they were a group of people who were doing quite, for the time, very, very bold, sort of a bold way of living, where you weren't keeping your feelings wrapped up all the time. You were just being brutally honest with each other. And that did mean that they were quite loud. But I think the screaming element has been probably taken out of proportion by, the people who were living around them, who would never have encountered anything like that. I tried not to portray anyone too obviously as like who they would have been in real life, because I did want to make it fictional in my own way. But there are a lot of incredible documentary pieces that people have made about them with like old footage where you see them doing some bits of the therapy. Everyone called them the Screamers, but they didn't call themselves the Screamers. And the woman who had set it up was a woman called Jenny James, and she wrote several books and diaries of her time when she was in there. So I did do a lot of research in terms of reading her work and trying to make the way that she presents it more true to it than the sort of sensationalized pieces that were written about it. So in the novel, Michael is a boy who lives in Burtonport in the village, but he lives in an estate called the Atlan estate with his mum, and he wasn't born there, him and his mum. So this is all kind of taking place at the same time that the like after 1969, when the Troubles started kicking off and people were having to flee places like Belfast. So he's fled Belfast with his mother, and he is also of mixed race, which at the time as well would have been, you wouldn't be seeing anyone who wasn't white. I mean, even now in Ireland, in in villages and stuff, it's a very white community. So he's a boy who is the same age as Moira, the older sister. And he is someone who becomes, very important to both of the sisters' lives. So the first part of the book opens on the day of 9/11, and 16-year-old Kora Brady loses her father in the attacks. And in the weeks that follow, she's very unmoored, doesn't really know what she's doing until she gets this letter from an aunt who she didn't know existed. And then that kind of gets her thinking about her parents and how she knew that they were Irish, but she didn't think about that very much. And that was actually, I stole that idea. I had a friend who's at school whose mum was Iranian. And we were hanging out, and there was one time where someone mentioned her mum's accent, and she was just really taken aback. She was like, I didn't realize my mum had an accent, because to her mum just sounded like her mum. And she was just really blown away that we had noticed that her mum had an Iranian accent. So I was thinking about that, and in terms of Kora being Irish, but she's grown up in America her whole life, and how remembering that her parents had actually come from Ireland, she hadn't thought about up until that point really, and then it suddenly triggers a lot of memories, and she's sure that she's heard this place called Burtonport, which is in Ireland somewhere, and she's trying to figure out where that connection has come from. And she eventually remembers that she had this video game when she was a kid that her dad had given to her, and she can very clearly remember the packaging in particular more than the game. She remembers that the cassette came with this insert that talked about this old boarding school that was haunted, and where part of the game was that you had to figure out what was going on at this school and save the students. And she very clearly remembers what the house looked like on the cover, and then that house becomes the place that you go to in the next part of the book. And I did try in the different parts of the book, because you do go back and forth in time, and it can be a bit disorienting, but I tried to make it that there would be sort of a physical thing that would connect you to the next part. So you have that video game that Kora remembers, and then you end up in that place in the next section. The most close to the present part of the novel opens in 2018 with a new character. So it's quite, I wanted it to be quite a surprise that there's suddenly this new character that comes in the latter half of the novel. And I think I have always really enjoyed novels that jump around in time and where you build a bigger picture of the whole without ever getting the full story. And I especially like intergenerational versions of that, where if you think about your parents or your grandparents, you often kind of understand their story in relation to, my mum met my dad and then they had me, or my grandparent was born in this place and then they moved here. And, you can make sense of it in terms of your own biography. But I think I wanted to present different stories that were all sort of incomplete, where you're not getting a person's full biography and where there are these big gaps that you have to try and make sense of in your own head. And I think that I'm interested in that myself so I grew up in the house that I grew up in. It was my grandparents' house, and my dad had also grown up there. So my bedroom used to be my dad's bedroom, and there were just a lot of old weird things in the house, and I think I thought of myself as a bit of a detective, and I'd look through things and try to make sense of the stuff that was in the house and whether it had been my dad's or been my grandparents. And you definitely get that in this latter part of the novel, where 16-year-old Leica lives in what was the Screamer's house, but now it's just her home. And it's her great aunt's house, who is Roisin. And she, as she becomes older, a bit like what happens with Kora, she has a bit of a realization that there's stuff in the house that she's maybe seen as a child, which suddenly is going to have a bit of a new meaning to her. So she's a bit of an explorer within the house, and she's trying to make sense of what her mum's story might have been and what her aunt, who's effectively her grandmother, where they've come from. And she's figuring things out. So that's definitely a theme within the book, that people are trying to make sense of where they've come from.